And yeah, welcome to the first instalment of our online seminar series, What's Your Poison?, organised by the HERA-funded research project Intoxicating Spaces. And we're absolutely thrilled to welcome our first speaker, Professor David Guba. David is an educator and historian of drugs and imperialism in modern France and Europe, and currently teaches as an assistant professor of history at Early College Baltimore, and as an adjunct associate professor of history at the University of Maryland Global Campus. And significantly for our purposes, he is the author of Taming Cannabis, Drugs and Empire in 19th Century France, which came out this year with McGill University Press, which examines the untold story of France's first foray into medical marijuana during the 1800s and the ways in which France's imperial ventures in North Africa shaped French perceptions of the drug, both then and now. And it's about this wonderful new study that David's going to be talking to us today. And we're especially grateful to David as he's currently in Baltimore, where it's just gone 8 a.m. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping, so to speak. The plan is David will speak for around half an hour, and then there will be around half an hour for questions and discussion. There is a little chat feature on the bottom right of your screen. I think it says "Say Something Nice," which I see some of you are already availing yourself of. Thank you. Well, you're very welcome to post comments and observations throughout David's talk. However, if you have a question for David for the Q&A, please post it using the separate Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. I hope you can find that. You can post questions as they occur to you during David's talk, or save them until the Q&A session at the end. So if you want me to ask the question on your behalf, simply type it out into the box. If you'd rather ask your question yourself, just type question into the Ask a Question box and I'll invite you up onto the screen. However, do be aware the event is being recorded. So without further ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to turn things over to David and Taming Cannabis, Drugs and Empire in 19th Century France.
Okay, thank you very much, James. If you'll bear with me for a second while I just share this screen and make sure you can see my presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully you can see that. Yep, I see it. Excellent. All right, I'll press present. Very good. Thank you again to James and to Intoxicating Spaces for having me as the first speaker in this wonderful series. Thank you as well to the members and the research group that's part of Intoxicating Spaces, particularly Phil Withington, Twine Peters, and Stefan Snelders at different points in my career, particularly with the Alcohol and Drugs History Society. I've had a great opportunity to talk with many of you, and those talks and conversations have really been useful in pushing my work towards the final production of this book. So thank you very much for having me and for listening to me as I work through these ideas these past couple years at the various conferences. In today's presentation, I want to talk about my book. I want to talk a bit about why I wrote it and some of its contributions to French history and the history of drugs and medicine. I also want to, and just to make sure, yep, everybody can hear me. Very good. Okay. I, like everybody else, feel when you're talking at a screen, maybe no one can hear me. I'm going to give some brief synopses of the chapters and try to keep that within 30 minutes so we can leave plenty of time for Q&A, which will be the last 20 or 30 minutes. So let's talk a little bit about why I wrote this book. One of the main reasons that I wrote this book is I was fascinated by, particularly when I was living there, this reality that France today experiences the highest rate of cannabis use, particularly among the youth of any European Union nation state. And if you look at the graph here, which is a bit dated, it's from 2017 stats from the years before, it shows that France is even among the world's leaders and consumers of cannabis. And this is for recreational cannabis. We're talking about intoxicating cannabis. But at the same time, France today has the harshest laws against cannabis in the entire European Union. Recreational cannabis has been illegal since 1970, and medical cannabis has been illegal since 1953. So I was very interested in trying to figure out where this sort of hypocrisy, or not hypocrisy, contradiction, where it comes from historically. Another thing that got me really interested in this topic, especially when I was working through a prospectus to work on a dissertation, was in the initial searches on this topic of cannabis in France, an epistemic link kept coming up over and over and over again. And that was between Muslims and Arabs and violence, and all linked together with the drug hashish. So there are many sort of manifestations of this epistemic link. One of the first and earliest, of course, is the story of the famous assassins of Alamut, which you see in the top left from an image from the 14th century. And this story, of course, involved hashish, and I'll get into how a man named Sylvestre de Sacy in France ultimately popularized this idea. But the overall story was that these assassins used hashish in various means to either dupe their potential disciples into murdering, or, as it's been sort of bastardized in later centuries, to use hashish before an actual murder. In the bottom left, you see a picture from a children's book in 2018, and this is actually a recreation of a story from the 1001 Nights, the famous Antoine Galland tale that's from 1700, originally published in 1700 in France. And this story is from Sinbad the Mariner, the fourth voyage, I believe. And on this voyage, there's an interesting story about cannibals in Africa capturing Sinbad and using this, what they call in the translation, a certain herb, a certain grass is the exact translation, to essentially dull the senses of their captors and make them hungry, so they eat, and then eventually they are eaten by the cannibals. And the idea here is that Sinbad catches on to this idea, this reality that the herb is going to be his downfall. He doesn't eat it, and then he is able to escape and sort of shuttle off to his next venture. There's also a link, not just in popular culture, but also in law, in French law. If you look at the 1970 law that I mentioned earlier, which made cannabis illegal as a recreational drug, there is language, and it's here at the bottom, that talks about the hashishans and these hashish-eating assassins as being alive and well and ultimately corrupting the youth of France. And this was in 1970. And this is from an Assembly Nationale, the minutes of the debates leading up to it. And then in 2015, when I was living in France during the terrorist attacks, the ISIS-backed terrorist attacks, many of the early commentaries across the French press were linking drug use to these particular attacks and Islamic fundamentalism. And there were numerous explicit references to the hashishan throughout the French press and largely across the political spectrums. And then, of course, there's Assassin's Creed, which I'm sure many of you, if any gamers out there, have seen before. And interestingly enough, they made a game that featured the French Revolution, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. This epistemic link, as I've argued in numerous works, is not just a discourse. It has, in many ways, and it's hard to prove because stats in France, race-based stats, are illegal since the 1970s. But there seems to be a strong correlation between the idea that Muslims and Arabs are prone to violence because of significant hash use and the ways in which cannabis is policed inside the French Republic. So I've written about this previously for the conversation and also for Slate, but there is a lot of statistics that we do have that are available that show that there's probably, there's a likely statistical correlation between mass incarceration of Muslims in France, which, as you can see in the top statistic, they are 9% of the population, but roughly half of the prison population. And there's roughly 16% of this prison population that is in prison for drug-related crimes, and almost all of those drug-related crimes are cannabis-related crimes. There's also another study that was done in 2008 and also in 2015, one by the CNRS and the other by the Open Society, and they found that Black and Arab Parisians were respectively 6 and 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. So there seems to be some kind of not only historical epistemic link, but one that has translated itself into modern day policy related to cannabis in France. There is, however, some movement in recent years to try and push back this prohibition regime in France. What you see in front of you now is from the website of the ANSM, which is the FDA essentially of France, and they are starting, or they're supposed to start, a trial here in January of 2021 involving 3,000 patients with therapeutic cannabis, as they call it. So that's some movement in the direction of legalization. There also, in the last month, has been a move to create a €200 spot fine instead of a potential prison sentence of a year and a €3,000 fine, which is the 1970 law. But this as well, I argue, and I'm writing an article on this currently, this also, it's a move in the direction of legalization, but it still does not ultimately dismantle the logic of prohibition. It really just simplifies the process of collecting a fine. So my book very much sits it tries to interject a historical or a greater historical consciousness into these particular discussions and dynamics involving cannabis, race, and citizenship in France today, but also going back through the modern period. So my book, which is largely based on my dissertation at Temple University, it starts the process of exploring the history of cannabis in modern France, which is largely responsible for the conundrums and hypocrisies currently plaguing French cannabis and drug policy. And over the course of this research, I found and discovered a vibrant early career cycle for cannabis medicine, particularly in the middle 1800s, and particularly centered inside France, and almost entirely ignored. Not entirely, there are a couple people who might be listening today who have talked a little bit about some of the key figures, but the vibrancy and the size and the importance and significance to French medicine of this moment of medical cannabis in 1840s and 1850s France was largely missing from the historical record. So what I want to do with the remaining 17, it'll probably be 20 minutes or so left, is I want to go through the chapters, some of them quickly, others of them I'll hover a bit more, particularly because, for instance, chapter 2, I think, deals a little bit more with space and the notions of who is supposed to be intoxicated in what space and by what intoxicant. So that is, I think, something important we can talk about for this particular research group. But yeah, I'll try to get through these without taking up too much of our time. The other contribution I should say, in French history, there are several people working on the history of cannabis and the history of drugs in general, but much of that work is focused on the 20th century or the late 19th century. Very little of it focused on the 1700s or 1800s. The other historiographical contribution I think my book makes is that most of the studies of French drug policy are very opium-centric and very nationalist in their interpretation, especially around the laws of 1916, which were formulated during the height of World War I and competition between France and Germany. So it's very much a story of nationalism, the story of drug policies and drug prohibition in France. But I argue that this story of nationalism, just like the story of nation states themselves, are set firmly in the story of empire. And to separate one from the other is to really miss the fuller context of how drugs, particularly in France during the 1800s and 1900s, became markers of otherness, markers of threats to the republic, markers of threats to universal republicanism, so on and so forth. So let me go into my first chapter. And I should also say the book is part of an excellent, and I'm the only book in the series, so of course I'm going to say it's excellent, but a really cool book series that McGill just put out called Intoxicating Histories with Virginia Berridge, Erica Dick, and Noel Plack. 3 unbelievable names in the history of drugs and alcohol. And they are the editors of the series. And I'm very, very happy to have been asked to be a part of this series. It's a true, true honor to have their names associated with anything that I'm particularly doing. The series is accepting manuscripts as well, so I should put that out there as well. The first chapter, which is called Competing Strains, I look at the prehistory of the taxonomy of cannabis, which takes place in the 1750s through the 1780s. But I look at what happens before, in the centuries leading up to this, particularly in France, to establish 2 separate ideals or profiles of the cannabis plant. So we're all likely familiar with the taxonomy that splits the cannabis plant into cannabis indica, which was coined and ultimately sort of institutionalized by Lamarck in the 1780s. And then cannabis sativa was coined and institutionalized as this classification in biology in the 1750s. In the first chapter, I argue that in France, in the centuries leading up to this official classification, which French scientists surely played a part in, they were already creating discourse about the two separate species of cannabis. They called cannabis sativa chanvre cultivé, which sativa in Latin actually does mean cultivated, and they called cannabis indica chanvre indien, or chanvre of the South, or they also made distinction chanvre du Nord for talking about cannabis of the North versus cannabis of the South. And more importantly than the names, what they were ultimately doing was affixing different narratives about the usefulness and the dangerous qualities of the particular drug in these particular narratives. So let me move forward here. Cannabis sativa had a very long and vibrant history in France, going back all the way to the time of Charlemagne, so the 8th century. And just like every other major nation state or major European power at this point, which will become a nation state later, they are reliant on hemp-based products, particularly for sail and for rope, for their naval power to extend across the seas. So the French, very early on, under the control of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and again, I'm moving into the Bourbon period, he establishes a hemp monopoly, very similar to the tobacco monopoly that they created in the 1600s. And with this hemp monopoly, they were able to consolidate and centralize the production of hemp rope through 12 different corderies, as they were called. And here's an image of one of these corderies in Rochefort-sur-Mer, on the Atlantic coast of France, near Nantes to a degree. And they also stimulated a significant amount of growing cannabis or cannabis sativa for hemp across the hexagon, across France itself, but also in its colonies in places like the New World. And there are significant number of documents throughout the 1600s, late 1600s and into the 1700s that talk about cannabis as a variable that is directly proportional to the power of the French state. So this really great document from 1800, which is a bit later during the period of the Revolution, but it is looking back and talking about the history of hemp in France. And it argues, let it be understood that when we cultivate 1 hectare less, the enemy the year after cultivates 1 more, and hemp secures their superiority. So for a country that is, especially today, very much caught up on pushing cannabis to into the realm of illegality, making it a prohibited substance, they are also historically trying to save a certain species of it or a certain type of it that they believe is more industrious and more reflective of their civilization. So when cannabis sativa or chanvre cultivé is ultimately logged in the botanical encyclopedias, it has a narrative associated with it that speaks to these ideas of national power, or I'm sorry, imperial power, secured through hemp production and naval power. So when you look at Lamarck's Encyclopedia Méthodique, which is one of the more famous botanical encyclopedias from the period of the Enlightenment or late Enlightenment, it has language in it that really speaks to this national heritage, an idea of what I call patrimoine, or what the French call patrimoine, but as I talk about in the book. And this exists today. There is a very vibrant group of people in France and organizations in France today that are together. They form what's called interchanvre, and they are a group of farmers and industrialists who are trying to push the French government to make cannabis legal. And they aren't trying to make all of cannabis legal. They are still, in the language, trying to make cannabis that's not grown for intoxicants, which has less than 0.3% THC. That's what they're trying to make legal. They very much want to separate themselves from any idea of therapeutic cannabis outside of CBD, or any idea of recreational cannabis. They've more or less politically set themselves on a path that rejects intoxicating cannabis altogether. There are some inside interchanvre that might disagree with that, but more or less their public policy seems to dictate that. And then even more, you can go to Rochefort-sur-Mer to this day, and you can see the cordery and the hemp production facilities from the 1600s and 1700s. And it's part of sort of the tourism of France, and part of what are called days of patrimoine, these journées in which you can go and celebrate the heritage of France, and you can usually get in free. So even still to this day, from the 1600s through today, cannabis sativa is this thing in French history and French culture and French law, right? Jean-Baptiste Colbert creates a monopoly that regulates this. It is considered a natural part of French nationalism. But when you look at the discussions of the other species of cannabis, chanvre indien, they very much attach it to stories of otherness, stories of not only racial otherness, but civilizational otherness, stories of irrationality, issues of lust, any sort of negative quality or anti-value that you can think of that is coming out of the 1700s, sort of the early modern period of Europe. You find these anti-values linked to chanvre indien. So I don't want to spend too much time reading too much of these, but you find this in travel logs. So when people like Carsten Niebuhr, he's not a Frenchman, I believe he was Danish, and he was part of an expedition that was funded by somebody else. Anyway, really famous explorer from the 1700s. As he's making his way through the Arab world, he consistently mentions seeing people who are using cannabis to tranquilize themselves and to believe themselves invincible. So again, building on this narrative of these people from the colonized world are using this drug to essentially commit violent acts, which then later will be connected to anti-state violence. And then, of course, another voyager, Sonini, he argues that as he watches people in the Arab world use keef, another name for hashish, that it annihilates their reason, literally annihilates their reason. So these ideas that are circulating in other discourse outside of science, when it comes time to formulating the idea of the botanical biological classification for cannabis indica, these ideas make their way into the scientific literature and become key features of the profile of the drug itself. So even before cannabis sativa and cannabis indica are formalized as a taxonomy, there is an effort to, and not a conscious effort to demonize a drug, but an effort to link a drug to an expanding and developing concept of what the colonial world is like, particularly the Arab world in the French eyes. And I showed you this image earlier, and a 2018 children's book still has this imagery and association. They take out the word cannabis, but they use the word grass or herb. But the story is still very much the same. You have Africans who are deemed cannibals, thus irrational and violent. They use this intoxicant to dupe their captors, and then once they are nice and fat and barely conscious, they are taken advantage of and eaten. So again, this idea of two separate species of cannabis, one attached to the national heritage of France, the other attached to the otherness of the colonial world. In chapter 2, and I'm going to try to speed up a little bit, I apologize. I rewrote chapter 1 before after the dissertation, and I very much like that book, or like that part. Okay, chapter 2, I get into the first time that the French actually encounter cannabis intoxicants in person in real life. And for the 1600s and 1700s, most often cannabis to the French person is coming through discourse. It is coming through language. There's very little direct engagement or experience with cannabis intoxicants unless they're an explorer who self-experimented, or perhaps a doctor. There are a few that moved around in the 1700s that I have records of that I found that were self-experimenting, but very, very few. It's not until the expedition, the Egyptian campaign of Napoleon during the French Revolutionary Wars, where Napoleon takes the French military, the Armée d'Orient, down to Egypt in an attempt to push the British out, or really establish a stronghold to then push the British out of India. So it was more of a staging ground to try to attack British power in the East. And it was a misadventure from sort of top to bottom. But there were several interesting features or developments that occurred in this campaign, which was only 1798 to 1801. And one of them was that Napoleon, when he first got there, he was very adamant about creating a sister republic that included a significant amount of Islamic ideas, practices, and culture. And a lot of people will argue, there are books on both sides of sort of the debate, that this was all political expediency and an attempt by Napoleon to really pull one over on the local elites. And then there's another group that argues, Cole, for instance, will argue that Napoleon was somewhat sincere about his reverence of the Prophet Muhammad, and actually did try for the time period, for the standards of the time, to integrate particularly the Sunni elite of Egypt into the political apparatus of the colony. And he creates a diwan, it's called, basically a directory very similar to what's going on in France. And he includes elite Sunni members from Egypt on that committee. He implements different French revolutionary events in public events, that he then brings in events from the Islamic calendar, celebrating for different Islamic holidays. So he published, for instance, a newspaper in Arabic as well as in French. So there were efforts, I think, but overall Napoleon sees that these aren't going well, and by 1800 he skedaddles. He gets out of there and goes to France and rises to become the Napoleon we know, and go visit at the Invalides. But after Napoleon exit, he leaves in charge one of the more famous generals in French history, Kléber. Kléber is quickly assassinated. Interestingly, this assassination has nothing to do with hashish, but later on in the literature, as we'll see, the hashishon become really, really important and really, really popular. So people will revise the story of Kléber's assassination to include hashish, even though all indications in the primary record say that's not the case. But after Kléber is assassinated, there's a really interesting general that takes control. His name is Jacques-François Menou, who I spelled his first name wrong. But Jacques-François Menou is a really interesting character because he took Napoleon's Islamic policies to heart. He converted to Islam. He married into a Sunni family in Rosette in French. He changed his name to Abdallah. And he really did. He worked in his final year, although the last 6 months or so he was fighting an onslaught and losing ultimately the campaign. So the last 6 months are mostly military issues, especially in the primary record. But for a good 6 months of let's say the late spring to the fall of 1800, Menou is doing a really he's putting a really concerted effort into trying to integrate the colonies. And what he does, if you look at his correspondence and orders of the day throughout this period, particularly September and into October, he consistently passes laws that are trying to limit the activities and behavior of French soldiers, who apparently are more and more using hashish and dawamask, and a drink that's made from sort of activated hashish, very similar to bang. So he keeps issuing these orders. There are 2 or 3 orders leading up to the ultimate ban in October. And what he's really saying is, you Frenchmen, you have to understand these Egyptians are now our brothers. They are now Frenchmen too. And you cannot be intoxicated and treat them so poorly. Obviously, the order is not listened to. So by October 1800, he actually places a ban on hashish, and he makes it illegal to sell hashish, make any liquor that contains hashish. And of course, they're using terms like liquor because they're viewing it as a fermented beverage, an intoxicating beverage. This chapter for me is what started me on this book. If many of you might have read in previous really good histories, in fact, the story of Napoleon passing the hashish ban, it's been published in French and German and Italian and English. And I found probably about 30 different books that mention this hashish ban. But when I got into the archives, I found that quite quickly Napoleon wasn't there. And I found quite quickly that Menou was there. So it took me some time. But at the Service Historique de la Défense at the Château de Vincennes, I was able to, in Vincennes, I was able to find this. And it's, of course, a manuscript, a copied copy of the order itself. But this is the oldest copy of it that exists. So, and the other thing I wanted to bring up, because this is about intoxicating spaces, and I promise I will jet through the next 3 or 4 chapters. One of the big issues of the ban were the café mar, or the Moorish cafes. And the issue of a café mar will become an issue for French politics, and especially policies regulating intoxication all the way through today. You can find discussion even in today's, especially French media, and especially American discussions of French culture, the issue of certain areas where predominantly Arab Muslim people live, and also that their cafes are centers, especially during the time of 2015, many of these cafes were presumed to be centers of terrorist activity, in addition to mosques. So Café Mars, from today's perspective all the way back to Manu's perspective, they seem to be centers and differently understood, right? Manu sees it as a center, a place, a space in which the kind of intoxication happening is threatening the social order of the colony. The Café Mars will become an issue in the 1850s when France is trying to colonize Algeria and take firm root. They see Café Mar as a place where the intoxication going on inside of it is producing some sort of anti-state sentiment and anti-state violence. And they will actually even be mentioned in the Code d'Indigènes, the indigenous codes, which are passed in the 1870s into the 1880s, which severely limit the powers and rights, and legal rights especially, of colonial citizens in places like Algeria. So Café Mars as a space of anti-state violence associated with intoxication by cannabis indica becomes a really political issue. And it's something that I did not write that much about, but the image that you see here is from the BNF. It's actually online on Gallica. And there are, so far I've done just a quick basic search. There are about 100 images from so paintings before about 1880, then images 1870 moving forward. So I'm hoping to write something. Perhaps I saw that you guys have a call for paper. That would be a good topic for that. But the Café Mar are very fascinating thing that I need to talk more about in my work. So after the hashish ban is passed, as I said, there's not much time left to see how it goes. There's only about 6 months left until, 8 months or so left until the French are really pushed out of Egypt for good. In the 3rd chapter, I follow the story of cannabis sort of chronologically as the Egyptian army comes back and news of hashish starts to spread in popular culture and across academia in France in the early 1800s. And I wrote this earlier. I wrote this in 2016, this chapter, and it was published in Shad, The Social History of Alcohol and Drugs. And it's about Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy. Sacy was the leading Orientalist and philologist in France. He was an advisor to Napoleon. He had a job at Collège de France. He was, what he said about the Orient, and quote unquote, the Orient is sort of the Middle East, the Arab Peninsula, North Africa. The Arabo-Muslim world is probably a better term for today's perspective. But Sylvestre de Sacy was considered, what he said about the Arab world, the Muslim world, the foreign world in general, was fact to French people. It was really, he was a hugely important academic. And he, catching wind and being a really good academic and knowing that, okay, I need to publish something that will hit a current event so more people will know about it, more people will be able to read it. He takes what he's hearing about the hashishan, which has been in French popular culture since the time of Marco Polo, released his travelogue in the 1300s. And he hears what the Egyptian troops ultimately got into and what Manu did in terms of the hash ban. And he puts this all together with his research, and he ultimately argues that he found in the primary sources an etymological connection between the term assassin, murderer, and the drug hashish. And that the word hashishan, or hashish eaters, was actually the base of the term assassin that was adopted by Europeans during the era of the Crusades, and then it ultimately became part of French, the French language and other languages as well. And there is a lot of argument at the time, a little bit of argument at the time, a lot of argument now about the degree to which this is true. Bernard Lewis has published on this. I think this is back in the 70s and 80s when he ultimately wrote his book on it. And he ultimately comes down to the conclusion that it was not a true term, that it was only used by a select number of people as a derogatory term to sort of talk down on the assassins of Alamut. But regardless of the veracity, then or now, people then very much believed it, very much took it as fact. And this idea that the assassins of Alamut were assassins because of hashish, and that it was not only an etymological link, it was a substantial link. This was cited a lot, not just in popular culture, as we saw in the opening slides, but it was especially cited by scientists, pharmacists, and physicians. And that's what really, that's what got me started on my fourth chapter. And this is a quote just quickly from one of the first journals of the Bulletin de Pharmacie, or the first issues of the Bulletin de Pharmacie, which was attached to the Society of Pharmacy of Paris, one of the first professional organizations of pharmacy in France. And they are reading Saussy. And in fact, this is a review of Saussy's work. You can see the description down here of the title. And they are basically saying, hashish is this dangerous drug that causes people to go crazy and act violent. But maybe druggists and chemists can figure out something about it that we can use for medicine. And this is ultimately where the idea of taming cannabis comes from, for me. Many of these scientists, much like Saussy, or took Saussy's ideas and believe they're developing sciences, whether it's medicine or whether it's pharmacy or both, were capable of taking this dangerous intoxicant and making it useful for Western civilization. So cannabis, whether it's the bifurcation of cannabis sativa and cannabis indica in the 1600s and 1700s through discourse, through popular discourse rather than scientific discourse, or whether it's by separating the idea of cannabis intoxicants used by a particular group of people are, produce violence, but if we use them using our particular science, we can somehow civilize them and tame them. So it's never about the plant itself. The plant becomes split and civilized in one direction, but barbarized in another. It's a fascinating, it's almost like a Rorschach test with a cannabis plant. After Saussy writes his tract about the hashishan, and after several scientists and doctors catch on to this and try to convince people to use it, numerous physicians, dozens, start to use cannabis to treat very serious ailments. One of the first people to use cannabis in France against disease was Aubert Roche. He argued that cannabis cures the plague. Ultimately, he wrote this because he was an anti-contagionist. He believed that the plague was not a contagion or transmissible, but was caused by miasmas that attack the central nervous system. And because he thought this about the plague, he believed that cannabis, and particularly hashish, this dangerous drug that excites the central nervous system, that if used properly and under the care of a Western physician, it could actually treat and counteract the symptoms of the plague. Sort of a psychotomimetic treatment, which will be used by another famous doctor. And this is Aubert Roche saying, I had learned from Monsieur de Saussy about cannabis and hashish. I had heard the quite general use of the drug, and I therefore sought it out, profoundly convinced that if this plant had intoxicating properties, it must have some medical power over the nervous system. So again, Western medicine can tame this dangerous intoxicant. There are many other doctors that set cannabis against some of the most feared and deadly or feared diseases of the time, particularly mental illness. Many of you know who Moreau de Tours was, the famous Dr. X of the Club de Hashishan, the self-experimenting group on the banks of the Seine that used cannabis, particularly Dalomesque, and then Dr. X or Moreau would watch and sort of record, and people like Gautier and Baudelaire was there once, even though everyone thinks Baudelaire was there all the time. He lived there is the problem, so he was there whether he wanted to be or not. But Moreau de Tours, very similar idea to what Aubert Roche believed. He believed that insanity, also a disease of the central nervous system. He was known as a physiologist of the day. He believed that mental illness was a physical ailment. But he argued that cannabis could not only allow you to experience what insanity was like, especially if you were a Westerner and trained, right? But it also was a good cure for insanity. Again, this psychotomimetic idea where, which is very homeopathic. If you can mimic the symptoms, you can somehow combat the symptoms. And he used Dalomesque, which was an edible, and coffee. And that was his #1 treatment for insanity. So I'm running a bit out of time, and I'll finish with the end of chapter 4. And I'm happy to talk more about 5 and 6, but I want to give you all time as well. The end of chapter 4, what I talk about is dawamesk, which was this edible, was widely used in the 1930s and early 1940s. But many of the doctors that were using it in numerous contexts and in numerous places, they argue that dawamesk was not effective because they could not standardize dosages. And the reason for this is they were getting shipped very different batches of cannabis or just already prepared dawamesk from different places with no consistency. So the early pharmaceutical market in the 1830s and 1840s is really travelers and traveling doctors sending colleagues samples back from their travels or bringing it back with them. So starting in the 1830s, people like O'Shaughnessy and then a group of two brothers, Brothers Smith, as I call them, from Edinburgh, they start developing different scientific methods for distilling cannabis tinctures. O'Shaughnessy really just dissolved cannabis in alcohol. The Brothers Smith came up with a very fascinating and intricate acid bath to produce isomerization, as it's called. But eventually in the 1840s, the French dominate this market. The previously mentioned Moreau de Tours, he actually convinces a guy named Edmond de Courtive to spend his career and devote his pharmacy doctorate to figuring out how to make a tincture, which he does and produces a really fascinating dissertation. But when he produces this tincture in 1848, another guy from Egypt, but a Frenchman named Bernard Gastanel, he sued de Courtive because he argued, Gastanel, that de Courtive ripped off his recipe. At this time, there are no patents or what are called right of priority on the actual formula. The only patent is on the brand itself. And this doesn't change until the early 1900s inside France. So they go to court, and really the court is the Academy of Medicine, and they argue back and forth about who created cannabis tincture first, which is fascinating because I had not read really anything about that. There was only one article that briefly mentioned it when I was doing my secondary research. And then finally, this is somewhat interesting for today's world because cannabis was declared a cure for COVID way back. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about how that's historically sort of repetitious, but also ridiculous. But in 1848, there's a massive cholera outbreak that strikes in Paris in December. And one of the arguments that was made by Gastanel was that his cannabis tincture was so potent and so good that it cured cholera. So in 1848 and 49, about 6,000 patients, as far as I can tell, were treated in Paris's hospitals with cannabis tincture. When that failed, they started to publish in May that cannabis tincture was not this miracle drug in May of 1849. And by 1850, 1851, cannabis tincture is slowly but surely declining in its popularity. In the final chapters, what I talk about ultimately is how the final blow to cannabis tincture as a drug in France comes as France embarks on its colonization of Algeria. And as they get to Algeria, they find living hashishans everywhere. Hashish using Algerians who hate French Empire and want to cause violence against it. And of course, it's not a product of empire or colonization. It's a product of cannabis intoxication. And that's ultimately where the book ends. I apologize for going a bit over. But I hope you enjoyed what I presented, and I look forward to taking your questions.
David, thank you so much for that. Absolutely fascinating. And we were treated to a beautiful Maryland sunrise as well, which was
I tried to cover it. Yeah,
particularly nice. No, absolutely beautiful and fascinating to see that. At one point in its life, cannabis was pressed into service as a plague curative or preventative, which seems to be par for the course for intoxicants, as we're also finding out. So yeah, I'll throw the floor open for questions right away. Again, if you want to use the little ask a question feature, you can either type it out or just type question in there, and I'll invite you onto the screen. We've had a fascinating comment from Mark Jenkins, who's actually asking about something that I was going to press you on, which is the connection between sort of cannabis and coffee, particularly in the context of these. Is it these sort of the Arabic sort of cafe Mars, or sort of cafes that had a predominantly Arabic clientele. Can you perhaps elaborate on this relationship between cannabis and coffee in the period?
Absolutely. I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to do a bit more digging about the exact preparation of the coffee itself. I'm no immediate sources are ringing a bell. But what I can say is that from the 1830s through I probably found some in the early 1860s, and you can find doctors reporting using these treatments, even hashish tincture, all the way into the 1900s, right? So it's just about frequency. But in the 1830s through the 1850s, Dalwamesque was almost always prescribed and used with coffee. And oftentimes it was dissolved. So Dalwamesque is an edible that has activated hashish baked into it, and it has nutmeg, and they'll put crushed up nuts, and I have figs were sometimes in it, honey. It sounds pretty good. And that would be the main edible. But oftentimes, then the French, of course, and other Europeans were copying and looking at what people in the Muslim world were doing. So this was a practice that was also happening quite frequently inside, what the French would call a café mar in the colonial world. But yes, the medical treatments almost always involved coffee, and I believe the medical logic behind it was increasing this excitement of the brain, increasing this sort of reaction from the nervous system or central nervous system. And again, I need to see, if they're talking about this sort of stimulant aspect of coffee or not. I can't quite remember. I mostly assumed that in my reading, but coffee was almost entirely present, almost always present when Dalwamesque was used. But when tincture is applied, you see coffee drop out. So I'd have to do a bit more digging to see if it fully drops out, but that's sort of that's what I'm remembering at this point.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Mm.
Brilliant. Okay, so we have a question from Phil. He says it's very interesting that French scientists started speculating about the medical potential of cannabis because of its similarities to other intoxicants. He'd like to know more about that, but also about the uses of cannabis in Arabic medicine and whether the French were also interested in those.
So I'll answer the last one first, right? So the French interest in Arabic medicine or Arab medicine was really, I guess, the people that I'm looking at, particularly dealing with cannabis, so Gastinel, de Courtive, they're not very interested in the way in which it was used in the Arab world. If you look at doctors who were practicing in places like Egypt, so Bernard Gastinel was in Egypt for a certain time, Aubert Roche was in Egypt for a while, and then the one doctor I'm really thinking of is Antoine Clot-Bey. He's one of the most famous doctors who was working in Egypt for Muhammad Ali Pasha. And he very much was against the use of cannabis and hashish for things like insanity and for things like the plague. And his main arguments in his documents, and he wrote quite frequently in the 1830s and 40s about cannabis. He was sort of a detractor, but he was a realist. He argued that in the Arab world, it's used as an analgesic. It's used as something that is useful for symptom relief, useful and not that dangerous. He even says not that dangerous as a vice unless used excessively. But he stops well short of saying that this is some miracle cure. And the reason he doesn't believe it's a miracle cure is he's seeing it used routinely by Arab, particularly Egyptian doctors in his particular practice. The more you get towards metropolitan France, the less the indigenous uses of the drug, especially medical uses, mattered. I find. So by the time, especially the story of tincture is entirely a story about civilizing or taming this dangerous intoxicant inside hashish. And they're very, very adamant, and they put a lot of effort in, French scientists, also the Italians and the Germans in the late 1840s and into the 1850s, to try to isolate the actual intoxicating agent inside cannabis. They're looking for THC, of course, which they're not going to find. But the point there is, once we can isolate that, we don't have to worry about the legacy of the indigenous medicine of the Arab world, which they very much connected to the inconsistencies of Dalwamesque. So Dalwamesque was this sort of, in the Arab world, used as an analgesic, used it with much more realism about its potential. versus in French context, they wanted to isolate this active agent, and they believed it much more powerful once isolated and sort of tamed into a tincture. So it's, not sure if that helps, that answers or not, but it's a partial appropriation of the ideas and then ultimately a rejection of them. In my particular reading, I know in other medical fields or subfields that the story is different, particularly psychiatry. If you move into the 19th century in French context, there's a lot more back and forth. But yeah, that's how I would answer that.
Excellent, thank you, David. We've got another question here from Gabrielle Gurian. Thank you, Gabrielle. Did the writings of the members of the Club de Hashish about cannabis influence in any way the French public perception about the drug and the passing of legislation regarding it?
Yes. So the most famous writings of the Club de Hashish are Gaultier's pieces in the Review of Two Worlds, the Revue de Dumont. Those came out 85, 86, 1845, 1846. Yeah, missing letters there or numbers. But Baudelaire's piece, the Paradis Artificial, which comes out in 1860, and is actually an accumulation of texts that he published in smaller editions throughout the 1850s, that has stood the test of time as sort of the manifesto of the Club de Hashish. And if you've never read it, it's an incredibly poetic. It's quite good in French. I think it's very well. It's still sold to this day. You can go into a French bookstore and it'll be there. But he essentially was he did not like cannabis. He believed, and people will argue, and people have argued, especially in my book. I talk about this in chapter 5. Baudelaire, as far as I can tell from his private letters, from his private correspondence, particularly with other members of this club, he did not enjoy the first experience. He lived there. He was renting a room at the Hotel Luzon on the Ile Saint Louis in Paris, which is the island over from Notre Dame. So he was there when everyone was doing this, but he watched it once, participated once, and it's, from all we can tell, he hated it. And in his book, to sort of summarize, he argues that wine is a godly intoxicant that allows French people to produce all the culture and political ideas and freedom that they're able to produce, versus cannabis is an antisocial, anti-national drug that produces behavior of isolationism that ultimately threatens the state and the universalism of France. He also argues that nobody can do art or write good work on cannabis because it alienates oneself from the self, or from not only the self, but from the community. And ultimately, what I argue is he's explaining his bad time. He had a bad time on cannabis, and he did not quite enjoy it. And he ultimately sets it in this poetic sort of dichotomy of good wine versus bad cannabis. Now, why that's important, to answer the question, is this text is routinely cited by politicians from that time through the 1916, during those debates, it's cited. And in 1969, leading up into the 1970 law that still stands to this day for cannabis prohibition, they are citing Baudelaire's Le Paradis Artificial to talk about the anti-state isolationism and anti-state violence caused by cannabis use. So absolutely, and this is one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book. Myths, especially once I got into it for a dissertation, myths about cannabis dominate the discourse today in France. So whether it's Napoleon's ban, which obfuscates and keeps silences from history, this very fascinating story of colonial mimicry and integration, or if it's ideas about Baudelaire being this sort of, and then the argument is, this other side of the argument is people think Baudelaire did a bunch of hashish, and because he excessively used hashish, there are many people that argue he died because of it. And if you know anything about Baudelaire, he didn't die because of hashish. He died because of opium. He died because of laudanum, right? Like that was his major downfall. He was an opium addict. He was broke because he was consistently trying to buy laudanum. So cannabis has been sort of snuck in there as the downfall of Baudelaire, and then both are used as a justification in 1969 for why France should ultimately make the drug illegal.
Excellent, thank you, David. We have another question here from Jamie Banks. Thanks, Jamie. He wants to know if you have any idea or thoughts on why Damask caught on in French psychiatric medicine, while marjoram or cannabis-infused sweetmeats failed to do so in British medicine, whereas he knows men like O'Shaughnessy and later Clouston experimented with tinctures extensively, but never marjoram for some reason. So why this this sort of traction within French psychiatry?
I would say it's the colonial and geographic context. So rightly so, O'Shaughnessy is working in India and Calcutta, if I'm not mistaken. And in Calcutta, I might be wrong. I'm not as versed on cannabis cultures at this time period in India, but bang is the preferred use of cannabis, as far as I know, which is a distilled or a boiled drink of sorts. So if bang is the primary form of cannabis intoxication, I understand why, or it makes sense that O'Shaughnessy would either bring bang back, or he would try to make a tincture made from the raw material that's in bang. With the absence of Damask in the Indian context, I think that's ultimately why you don't see as much of a direct connection. Had there been more of an edible, I'm sure called something else in Indian context, and I'm sure there are. Like I'm just not knowledgeable of it. But in the readings I've done of those early tracts coming out of, was it the Calcutta Journal of Medicine or whatever, wherever O'Shaughnessy published first in the 1830s, 1838. He's primarily talking about bang, and he's primarily talking about his efforts to do tincture. Versus in the French context, almost immediately as soon as they get there, especially in the Egyptian campaign, but then the doctors who follow the Egyptian campaign, working for Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt especially, they are, just as bang is ubiquitous in India, Damask is ubiquitous in France. So in the same way O'Shaughnessy is writing about bang and tincture, I think you have a similar dynamic afoot with Damask and tincture in France. And that's what explains the absence of the drink. There's really not much discussion of the drinks. There are some. There are also numerous clubs de hashichon that operated in France in the 1840s, not just Moreau's. I found near a dozen. So they were vibrant. I'm sure one or two of them, experimented from time to time with different forms of consumption.
Brilliant, thank you, David. I hope that answers your question, Jamie. I'm just looking. There are no more questions in the box, and we're approaching the witching hour. So I think we're probably going to wrap things up here, but it remains for me to say thank you so much to David for getting our series underway so splendidly, and to offer our warmest congratulations on the book, which you must definitely purchase. And I don't know if there's a little round of applause emoji on here. Yes, there is. So we should put in a little clap. Let's see. There it is.
Wonderful.
So thank you, David. Yep, our next seminar is 2 weeks today on Wednesday, the 20th of October, between 1 and 2 p.m. when we have Lila Chambers from New York University, who will be speaking on rum in the early modern Caribbean. And do register for that via our website. And I've just posted the link below. If it should have popped up, if you see seminar schedule, that will take you to the full series and registration page. So thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you again in a fortnight's time.
Thank you.